We're going to move into our fourth and last project before we have the panel discussion later. One of the things that came out of the conversation last night by Nina Maria, she talked about, why aren't we letting rivers order cities as opposed to cities order rivers? And so that there's a great deal of interest that have developed in riverfront. And we've bookended this set. We had a river to start out with today, and we're ending with a river today with different motivations and different interests. But still, the sort of notion of water has become a really important part of dealing with sustainable cities and landscapes. And so we're fortunate. And by the way, I've been really short on the introductions of the people because it's all on the website. And we wanted to focus on the project. So if you want to know more about these really interesting people that have made these presentations, you can go to the website and we have the bio information they gave to me, so you can really learn more about them and maybe have contact information. You might want to email them and say hello. But so now we have the benefit of Christopher Gates, who's a principal at MVVA, known as Michael Van Valkenburgh and Associates, and Matt Fisher, who's the branch manager with Brightview. And this one will be an interesting perspective because we have designer and contractor in this process. And so let's enjoy.
Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you guys for sticking around on a Friday afternoon. I know that you're halfway out to happy hour already, so appreciate it. As Mark mentioned, Matt is with Brightview Landscape Development. They were the landscape.
Put your microphone up just a little bit.
Let's do this.
Trouble.
Is that a little better?
There you go.
All right. So Matt and I have really been working together for the last 4 years or so through the bidding process, and then through plant procurement and obviously construction, and now sort of wrapping up this last phase of work on the project. So it's been a great experience to kind of get to know him and his team through the last few years. So the gathering place, now I'm echoing. The gathering place is a 66-acre park in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was for the George Kaiser Family Foundation. For those of you who don't know, they're a philanthropic group in Tulsa. George was born and raised there, and he gave away a large sum of money to start this foundation. They do a lot of different initiatives around town, from early childhood education to other health initiatives, and so this is actually a little bit outside of their typical line of work. But what happened was they basically came upon, excuse me, a few parcels of land that came up for sale right along the riverfront, and they sort of jumped at the opportunity, not really knowing what they were going to do with it, but knowing that it was a great opportunity and something, down the line would come of it. So they hired a firm to do a few different master plan studies, and it didn't really, wasn't kind of the product that they were looking for. So back in 2011, they held a design competition for 4 selected firms, and lucky enough, we were awarded the project, and so really started in earnest on it in the fall of 18. It's about a 7-year project, which is actually insanely fast, given the scope of the work and all the different parties involved. So I'll jump right in. The project site is about 2 miles south of downtown. It's fronted right on the Arkansas River. The Arkansas River is a prairie river, like you've seen in some of the earlier presentations. This particular section, the water is managed by an upstream dam called the Keystone Dam. It's about 15 miles outside of the city. But what happens is you get these twice daily, pretty drastic different flows coming down and impacting the edge of the site. So in certain instances you get this sort of lake condition, which is above the dam. And on the south side it's much more sort of wild. And so, is that me? Yeah, right. So there's an existing low water dam sort of right at the midpoint of the site. And you can see sort of some of the sediment that's building up behind there, and I'll touch back on that a little bit later. But the site was made up of 4 different parcels. divided by a major commuter route to downtown called Riverside Drive. Obviously, it had a lot going for it in terms of its presence on the river, but it also had these series of bike and pedestrian trails, which are noted in green. So they run up and down both sides of the bank, and also connect straight through some of the neighborhoods and provide you access to downtown. So one of the biggest assets was how connected the site was to the adjacent neighborhoods. A couple of existing photos just to kind of help you understand what was on the site. Large expanse of lawn space in the middle. This is known as the Blair property on the north side. You can see Riverside Drive, really bisecting the site and preventing a real strong connection between the waterfront and the site proper. Another great asset on the site was this existing woodland, and that will, again, I'll touch back on that in a little bit. Again, just a sort of, you can see downtown in each of these photos, just as a point of reference. But very flat, very uninteresting, not a lot of variety. Then on the opposite side of the roadway, you had this really wild and woolly landscape. I mean, just kind of the place you would really want to go to as a kid and start exploring and spending, days down there. I would anyway. So out of the competition phase, there were a couple of key components that came out of that, or a couple of main ideas. Obviously, with the ambitions of this foundation in creating some landscape or some place for people to come together, you needed to sort of match those ambitions with a much larger site than 4 different pieces. And so, the main idea was really to try to connect these different parts and make it feel like it was a continuous park space, so that when you're moving from one space to the next, you didn't ever feel like you were leaving the site. The next one, Tulsa's a pretty comfortable place. Everybody has their own gardens, their own backyard space, a lot of generosity in terms of space and just a level of calmness. And so one of the things that became fairly obvious with visiting the city a few times, speaking with the client group and some stakeholders, was that this really needed to be something special to pull people out of their own backyards, excuse me, and get them actually wanting to spend time with their neighbor, right? Like, I don't know about other Midwestern cities, but they like their space, they like sort of being alone. And this was like a real effort to try to bring the community together. We had a whole series of public engagement sessions to try to really understand if the key concepts that were developed during the master plan phase, where we actually didn't have the privilege to engage with the public, still held true. And so we had some meetings around different models. We went to different neighborhoods throughout the city, spoke one-on-one, set up a project website, and everybody was able to solicit feedback that way. And we took all of that feedback and tried to categorize it into a series of larger categories, some related to program types, some related to existing site elements and some of the issues that were present then. And then out of that came a series of design principles. So for the master plan, we'll focus on just really the top 3, which is creating that level of diversity that I hit on, the variety of activities, and making sure that the site was connected both internally but also on a much more neighborhood scale. So to try to get people to understand what was being proposed, this was the last public presentation, but I think some people are good at reading drawings. Others respond better to models where you can actually see some of the topographic change being proposed. And so this, I think, helped a lot of conversations, sparked a lot of debate, a lot of new program ideas, also a lot of references to places that we didn't know of before. And so 2 places in particular that had a huge influence on how some of the program was developed in the site, how the spaces actually felt in their built condition. This is Chandler Park, where there's these crazy series of limestone outcroppings, it's just an insane place to visit. The next is the Tallgrass Prairie, which many of you probably know. And this I'll touch back on in a little bit. So that idea of variety and a kind of place for where there's something to do for everyone, big open lawn spaces, much more smaller garden scale spaces, those stone elements like I mentioned, and that kind of developed into this master plan. This master plan is actually quite current. And the way that Matt and I had broken this down really was to develop the whole plan or cut it up into a series of 27 different smaller projects, which honestly it actually wound up being, just given the different program types, planting specialties, things like that. So it was a way to kind of talk about it and not have it be so scary in terms of how you would actually construct something on this scale. So the first piece, like I mentioned, is connecting the site. Not only was it important to acknowledge the neighborhood connections and also the park be a good neighbor, but much more on a larger neighborhood scale and understand how other park spaces would connect to it. And then finally, identifying partners for the future, whether it was Boy Scouts, YMCA, local gardening club, but having that sort of infusion and support all along was really important. So connecting the site. The whole site from north to south is it's almost a mile. It's about 4,800 feet. And so we knew that there needed to be a whole series of different types of connections, some over the roadway, some at grade that would connect back to the neighborhoods, and some actually under the roadway. And so in certain instances, we brought soil up and over the roadway, like this image. These are two what we call land bridges, where the park space literally spills from one side of the park over into the waterfront. They're built on a whole precast concrete system, and then we custom made the ends, excuse me, so that it felt much more integrated into the land. This also shows how we provided some lower trails at the water's edge and helped that whole river's edge become much more accessible than it was. In this instance, this is Crow Creek towards the southern end of the park, and we lifted the roadway about 8 feet higher than it was and replaced this 30-foot wide opening with about 120-foot span bridge. This will lead eventually into the phase 2 project site, which it just dead ends at the moment. So we're going to get into a little bit about how to construct something this big. This was not by any means a balanced site. All of the blue that you're seeing here is representative of areas of fill. The red is areas of cut. So you can see the disparity between the two different areas. Now, remember that photo that I showed you earlier of all that sediment building up behind the dam? When that was originally permitted with the Army Corps, the Parks Department was required to remove a certain amount of sediment on an annual basis, and they didn't have the budget over the last 10 plus years to do so, so it kept building up and building up. So it just so happened that gradation of that material met our engineering requirements. So we basically took about 300,000 cubic yards out of the river, so we helped them with their maintenance issues and used that as the subgrade material to build the park. Just kind of some fun facts that Matt put together in terms of not only the general fill, but what it took to make those different horticultural soil profiles, which we'll get into here. So to date, the park has received about 1.5 million visitors, and it's only been open since September. And so I think part of our job is to try to anticipate how that visitorship would impact the park and develop soil profiles that not only sustain that level of traffic, but also help support the vision of plant diversity and how things can sustain themselves without too much management.
Yeah, so if you look at the soil profile, one of our biggest components of our contract was the soil installation. About 25% of our total contract was soil installation. So we had to import about 200,000 cubic yards of soil for the job. And trying to do that with a consistent profile to meet our quality requirements was quite a challenge. So this is just a good example of you're gonna see some pictures in a minute of where we mined the soil. But that top 3 foot is basically a sandy loam soil. We've got a couple feet of what we call sugar sand, and then we get into the clay. Well, we didn't want much of the clay, so once we hit the clay, we had to kind of stop digging and move to a different spot. Well, the challenge is over thousands, millions of years, those soil profiles are different everywhere. So it was quite a challenge to get consistent soil requirements with the varying levels of soil profiles that we were digging through. So that was one of our biggest challenges. You'll see on the next page, we've got the mining operation. So we had a 15-acre site off-site. It was about 20 minutes northwest of the site. And we were hoping we could just dig down 20 feet, pull all the soil together, combine it, mix it up, and send it to the site. Well, it didn't work like that. We got about, the first kind of foot was all organics, lots of roots, lots of just stuff we didn't need at the job. So they hauled that off, sold it to somebody else. We took the next little bit, and as you can see, we're benching right there. We're mining about 6 foot over about 15 acres. And we did this over about a 1.5 to 2 year period of time. And, but again, it varied. You can't really tell because our operator would come back and smooth it out, but it varied. Some spots we'd be 8 feet deep, some spots we'd be 3 foot deep. And it was all dependent on the soil that was brought in. This is our mixing yard. So the mining pit was just past those trees that way. This is a scarab. This is a big, gnarly looking machine. This is a compost turner, basically, is what it amounts to. And it has just huge tillers underneath there. And what we would do is, based on the soil requirements, we'd combine sand, sandy loam, a little bit of clay, add compost as we needed. We had 5 different soil mixes, either a 2-to-1 with kind of sand and compost, a 3-to-1, 4-to-1, just kind of depends on the areas. But you can see the mixing yard. The horticultural subsoil, I think, was about 150,000 of our 180,000. That was the largest percentage of our soil. The clay wetland soil is a heavier clay. We used a special mix for that. And then on the steep slopes, we'll talk about slopes in just a second, but we put fibers in there. This is probably a question half of y'all won't know, but does everybody here know what a cassette tape is? Yes? No? All right. Well, the fibers in the soil is basically, if you pulled all the roll out of the cassette tape, it's similar to that. And what it does is help hold the slope, help hold the soil on the slope. So we'll look at some installation techniques we're using. This is the testing requirement. So with a job of this size, this important, soil was something we had to get right. So the quality of the soil and the consistency of the soil was very important. You probably can't read all this, but this is the process we determined at the beginning of the job is what we're going to have to do throughout to make sure the soil was consistent and met the quality requirements that NVBA wanted. So each component, which was sandy loam, sand, clay, compost, and a few others, each got their own individual test, and we did rounds and rounds of testing to try to find the best sandy loam. We went south, we went all over Tulsa, and we were considering shipping it in from hours away to get the right kind. Finally found one that worked. Then we had to start combining those into the mixes that we needed to, and we had to do small batch testing. So the first small batch was 20 yards. We'd mix it up and test it, make sure we got it right. Then we'd move to 250 yards, and at the end of the job, we were just testing every 1,000 yards. But on 175,000 yards at multiple components, multiple tests, I mean, it was a lot of money to test the soil. And then we had to test it again when it got to the job just to make sure that, again, we had stayed consistent with the product all the way through. So the soil was a huge piece and very important part of our project, and so we just wanted to make sure we got that right. We felt like as a team, if we don't get the base layer right, we're not going to get the rest of it right. So it was a big focus for us. Next picture, this is the wetland areas, and we'll see some more pictures of this in a minute. But as you can see, there's some aggregate in there, and it's just we're placing soil as we go. It's got some of the stone weirs and some different areas. So it was just a tricky installation. And this was also the very first piece we did. So the wetlands were installed probably almost, not quite 2 years, a year and a half ahead of the rest of the project, just because when you got this big of a project, you kind of got to go with what you can. So you can see we laid down some filter fabric in some areas, just in the wetlands, and put some soil on top of that and plants, and you'll see a little bit more of that in a minute. But hands down, the trickiest part of the job was you saw all the fill, you saw all the blue on that previous page with Chris showed. And the fill was very, very tricky because of the slopes. That you can't really get a gauge, but our guys had to sit on their butt and crab crawl down the slopes to make sure we didn't trip and fall. They were that steep. And aesthetically it looked great, but our challenge was how do we place that soil? So we bought a $100,000 long reach excavator that is about 3/4 of a yard bucket is what that holds. We had 175,000 yards that we didn't place just with that machine, but we placed a lot of yardage with that machine. It was running nonstop. So if you look at the detail there, somebody brought up compaction earlier in a previous discussion. One of the issues is we could compact the heck out of it, but then, that's not what we want. We determined that per the specs, and we didn't drive any machines on any of the dirt. Or soil. We don't have dirt.
Yeah, come on, man.
So we didn't drive any machines on the soil. And so that was a challenge in areas that are hard to get to. So we had to work backwards out of a lot of areas. But this was a challenge, is how do you get the soil to stay without sliding down the hill? Because we would have the soil placed for months sometimes before we actually got the shrubs, trees, or grass seed mixes held most of these slopes, which you'll see in a minute in some other pictures. But the geogrid layers are really what held it. And so if you look, the red lines, what we would do is we would place the soil, and then the geogrid would be held up, and then we lay the geogrid down on top of it, place another layer of soil going up the slope, place the geogrid down on top of it. So the geogrid had to go in layers, and that was a very slow, meticulous, tricky part of this process. So just the soil placement without compacting the slopes and doing it safely was very, very important.
So one of the things that I mentioned earlier was this idea about this diversity of program and supported by all the public input. And honestly, with all of this sort of wish list that were generated from the public input sessions, we could have used a site that was, twice the size to try to accommodate everything. And so it just meant thinking about it differently and being a little bit more inventive about how to accommodate all of those different program pieces. And so, obviously there was a tremendous amount of earthwork happening just to sort of bring the land up and over the roadway. And that also, we carried that a little bit further in terms of how to accommodate so much program in a relatively small site. And most of that was done through topographic change, where you're really kind of containing certain spaces, certain program elements that are next to each other but not necessarily complementary. So that was a huge driver in sort of the final form of the park. So this just shows just two instances of that actually it being carried out. On the left-hand side, there's a great lawn, which is the biggest lawn space in the park. You would think that you'd want a sort of quiet picnic space, but it's actually bounded by two playground spaces on either side, right? So you can imagine just the level of noise sort of coming out of those spaces when you're just trying to kind of sit and relax and enjoy the view. So one of the strategies was, again, to try to think about, containing this, and in this instance, this whole space was sunken down. So it helps not only visually, but acoustically. And honestly, this is about a 20-foot or so grade change. And 20 feet to a kid is just, it's a mountain. So it doesn't take a lot, depending on who your audience is, right? It doesn't take a lot of topography change for it to feel really impactful experientially. So, and this is the great lawn next to it. So the slide veil is actually just beyond this knoll here, and it, you can't see one from the other. So it's, I hope, successful. I mentioned earlier that there's a bikeway an existing bikeway that runs north-south through the park. We obviously realigned that as part of this project, but one of the important things was that this is a sort of moment calm. It was such a heavily used trail. People go there after work, ride their bikes, go for a run. And so it was our intent to try to preserve at least a little bit of that sort of calmness and views to the river and those types of things. Now you can see all the different program dotting alongside the path, but again, the same or similar strategy about trying to create some grade separation, whether there's sunken spaces, raised berms, or whatever, so that you can actually experience it, you and the river, or you and your friend going for a run or something like that. So these are the different types of spaces just along that same route. The Sky Garden on the land bridge, the bike park, sport courts, stormwater management areas, and this mitigation area that we'll talk about in a little bit. And this is just entering. You can see the bike park is on the left. As those plants grow up, obviously it will be almost completely screened, and it sort of reestablishes your relationship with the river. Another big component is materials. If you remember that image of Chandler Park that I showed earlier, it was a huge inspiration in terms of this space in particular. This is known as the Four Seasons Garden. It was actually kind of a stupid name that we came up with like right before a public meeting, and then like you can't get rid of it, right? Somebody starts calling it that, and that's the end. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing Four Seasons about it, but anyway, so it was a fun process to kind of take some of those inspirational places, figure out actually what the reinterpretation of that might be. And it started with making visits to quarries, understanding their capacity not only for fabrication but to be able to supply a job. I think I have some facts and figures on it, but there's something like 5,000 tons of stone, like just in this garden space, which is about 800 feet long. And so, the idea really is that the stone on the project is not used in a typical way. It's used in a very unfamiliar or hopefully surprising way. It's not about ornamentation, but it's really about shaping spaces in your experience through the park. So the slide veil that I showed you earlier, just as a means to obviously get up to the top of the play space and also to stabilize the banks. And then this is a moment at the Lodge building. For those of you who don't know Max Goggin and Merrill Elam's work, I would definitely recommend looking them up because they're possibly two of the best American architects alive, not to mention the sweetest people ever. But really, people talk about wanting to integrate architecture and landscape, and I think that they are a firm that really strives to do that and understand how you move around and through a building, how you approach it, what you're looking out from the building onto. So they've been truly inspirational to work with. And then you make your way out to the waterfront, and there are certain requirements that you need to meet with the Army Corps of Engineers in terms of a sort of specified riprap sizes, materials that hold up to abrasion and things like that. But it really shouldn't limit you to how that material gets used, the form that it takes. And so this is actually just, this is a stormwater management area that takes some of the roadway runoff and filters it through a series of gardens and then out to the river. And also just the beginning of our mitigation area that I'll talk about later. Just more stone that is used to really shape, again, your experience of the place. The pond water comes up quite a bit from here, but you can actually rent boats and canoes from the boathouse and actually paddle through here, which is quite an experience. And then just to go back to the use of stone, both in the landscape and architecture, and I think this is a sort of good image to kind of represent, a real integration of the two. And finally, one last stone image, just because this is one of my favorite spaces in the park. But again, this is not about stone as ornamentation, but stone as actually shaping your experience and feeling like you're carved down and in a space. We actually built a lot of physical models and handed those to the contractor so that they can understand what we were looking for. The tendency with traditional masons is to try to do like a really neat job, right? Align all the joints, align all the stone, and it sort of takes the life out of the walls and things. And so we probably ripped portions of this down 4 and 5 times just to kind of get those shadow lines and the break points on the corners. Again, just to try to bring a little bit of life back to it. As Mark mentioned, water is a huge component of many of our landscapes, and it was so at the gathering place. Not only the presence of the Arkansas River, but it served as a launching point for our strategy on how to deal with the Blair site, which is this one on the lower left. So the initial concept was to try to create a much more inwardly focused landscape on that piece of land and have the waterfront landscape be much more about the waterfront. To do that, this is a quick before and after. Just keep your eye on the Public Service of Oklahoma building. So this is same vantage point, but the whole center of the site was dropped down to the lake level or pond level, which is about 15 feet lower than existing grade. So this began to start to give form to the whole park. All the different park activities sort of front onto this. And it also takes the roadway out from view. And honestly, it's a nice sound attenuator as well. Because all of the different program was sited on the pond and fronting on that, we needed to make sure that it actually worked. Everybody was pretty skeptical of making ponds in that climate work, just because I think we're all used to sort of the pea soup condition, and that's become a familiar one, honestly, through some of our past projects too. So in order to sort of understand that, we need to kind of unpack all of the different variables and inputs that went into the design of the pond. So the first was to try to understand how the Arkansas River influenced the pond level. This is a groundwater fed pond, and so during different seasons, the groundwater levels could fluctuate as much as 4 and 5 feet. Now, because there was a requirement to have a sort of safety shelf around the edge of the pond where it was accessible, so that you didn't, as a kid, sort of step on the edge of the pond and immediately go down. There's about a 15-foot wide, much flatter sloped section. So we couldn't actually have the water fluctuate like that, right? All of those marginal plants would have dried up. And so we needed to come up with a strategy to help control the pond levels. So we actually created a slurry wall around the entire pond perimeter, and then excavated down to bedrock. And then later drilled a series of wells that then pumped into the pond. And there was a controlling outfall structure on the southern end, which then discharged to the river. There were 2 main approaches for trying to treat some of the pond water. One was to obviously keep it moving. The second was to try to take that water and refilter it through a series of wetland channels at the top of the park. You can see the image just there on the left-hand side. So there's about 1,200 feet or so of this wetland channel that helped with excess phosphorus uptake and those types of things. The next was much of the parking lot runoff was collected and then discharged into a series of underground infiltration basins. So it's basically an open bottom chamber with a gravel layer below that, and then sited in an area of the site where they had much sandier soils, so that it would promote that groundwater infiltration. And then, as I mentioned, we drilled these series of wells to feed the pond and also to feed the irrigation system. So the pump system pulls from the pond and redistributes that to the site. And then there's also another pump system that pulls from different points of the pond and recirculates that water through. So all of this is going towards, increasing the turnover rate of the pond so that we don't get, so that the water is cooler, it's less full of phosphorus, and it's not stagnant. So this is an image looking south. That's Mac's building in the background. That's the boathouse. Then river engagement. Just as important as the focus on the pond was this sort of reestablishment with your relationship along the river. Basically, there was an existing bluff with some hard elements along it, but you never actually had an opportunity to get down into this sort of landscape, not in an easy way. So So this was all about trying to fix that condition. This was a very early, very ugly rendering. But it sort of gives you the idea of trying to, again, create new spaces on the riverfront. This suggests something that's much more static than I think any of us are anticipating. I think we're acknowledging, as Marie mentioned yesterday, that these landscapes are not static things. They will change over time. The severity of the flood events will change. And so some of these lawn spaces along the lower edge we're fully anticipating being flooded, and they might not remain lawn spaces over time, but will start out that way. So the Army Corps requires this very deep riprap level all the way up to the 100-year and past the 100-year flood elevation in certain instances. And so we basically carried that through and then put a sacrificial layer of soil on top so that you weren't basically walking through a riprap landscape. So again, we'll see what happens to this layer. I mean, it might become something that's much more of a wetland over time, but we'll see. The next is a mitigation area. When you do any filling into the river or river of the U.S., you often have to do some mitigation to sort of offset your impact. And this actually created a huge opportunity for us. You could have paid a certain fine or credits for some mitigation work, but this actually allowed us to sort of complete the rehabilitation of the shoreline here. And so this is just on the south end of our site where Crow Creek comes in. And the idea was to try to reestablish this historic side channel that is a little bit more sheltered from the high velocity flows of the Arkansas. So a different species thrives there, different habitat.
Yep. For us on the construction side, this created a really unique challenge. Just landscaping in a river. It's not something we do every day. And then it was literally a jungle. This was just a solid mass of trees, vines. We had a lot of poison ivy. We sent 2 guys to the hospital with poison ivy treatment just because the poison ivy was so thick through there. It's not really a hiring requirement when you ask somebody, are you allergic to poison ivy? Yes, you can work here. No, you can work here. But we had to kind of go through that process to figure out who was and wasn't allergic to poison ivy so they could work on the mitigation areas. Second big challenge, we try to pre-task plan. We try to figure out everything that could possibly go wrong within a site and try to mitigate that on the front end. And one thing that was a challenge on this one that we didn't account for was beavers. Beavers were really a challenge. We had steel baskets. We had 250 trees, so we went through, cleaned it up. We spent almost a year just weeding, pulling vines, just keeping it because it just kept trying to come back, and it was a full-time job. But we planted 250 trees in here, and the beavers were wiping them out as quick as we could plant them. So, and a little side story, if you look at Crow Creek, it goes up about, a couple hundred yards past this page. We had a tree nursery up there, and we had about 1,000 trees that we were moving from site to the tree nursery to the site. That's where we would bring them in. And we paid a beaver eradicator many times to come to our tree nursery and pull beavers out of our tree nursery because you can't remove them ourselves. So anyway, it was an interesting challenge for this area. This is kind of the mitigation area after we've pulled the vines out and started planting trees. You can see some of the trees going in the background, but again, just creating a natural look for the water to flow through there. It was not just on the river, give it a kind of a side channel. So cleaned a lot of this up. You can see there's a lot of native weeds and grasses still trying to come in there. Flipping to the next page, this was the second one of the other challenges is as they release water through the dam, one day we'd be working in an area, it'd be dry as a bone, the next day it'd be 6 foot of water and there'd be no rain event, no anything. It was just they released water from up above and it came down. So many times trees laid over, lost some trees, just it became one of those things. We had our guys wearing life jackets if they were near the water just in case they released water. Just a set of challenges that you don't typically think about in the normal landscape installation. So, and then lastly, this was kind of one of the final products, and it just went back to, we created a native look without the jungle, and it was gives you access. There's some areas we spent a lot of time. I say that, and there's one picture of Johnson grass right here, but outside of that one, we pulled most of the
Plenty.
most of the stuff we didn't want, but really tried to create a natural creek bank that was friendly, that you'd want to venture down to and go visit. So the mitigation area was a piece that was really challenging for us as a contractor.
Just sort of bringing water back for a second. Obviously there's such an appeal about being near water and playing with it and any sort of level of engagement. And so, not only, like I said, those program features sort of centered on that as something to look out on, but we were really interested in introducing a level of engagement where people could actually touch the water and kids could play in it and run in it. And this is obviously conceptual rendering. We're almost there, almost finishing up this piece right now. But then there are moments throughout the park where there are playground elements like this, which is a water maze. There's also a lot of sand play and water to try to re-engage kids with natural materials. And so this is just one of those moments. Definitely access on the docks that were on the pond that you saw earlier. Different water expressions. This is in that crazy stone space that I showed earlier. But just, again, this is, Tulsa's climate, I'm assuming much like here, is that the summers are insanely hot and brutal. And to just find a moment when you're walking around the park to get some level of relief from it, I think is much welcomed. And there's a whole series of water expressions in this same sort of zone where we're starting at this obelisk and it's running through these steel channels, then finally these stone runnels, and make their way down to these the koi ponds at the end, which kind of form the base of Mac's Lodge building. So there's a lot of outdoor seating where you have the acoustical qualities of the water splashing, and it's a comfortable space. The next thing is really about horticulture, and honestly, with any of these elements, we could have spent an entire lecture on here. So there's not a whole lot of in-depth, not a whole lot of detail in this section. But if you guys have questions after the fact, please hunt me down and we can talk about it a little bit more. Tulsa's in this really interesting in between of the prairie landscape and a forest one. It's known as the cross timbers for those of you that know. And so these are two drastically different landscapes, which are really actually quite familiar to most people in town. They're all obviously within driving distance, and I think experienced in some way or another. You get both of these types within Tulsa proper as well. So this was sort of an overlay on the park as a kind of backdrop for the planting approach, while the more programmed spaces had their own sort of horticultural intent. I can't not mention that gardening and horticulture is a huge part of Tulsa's culture. They have all of their museum landscapes, their teaching gardens. There's a lot of community outreach and education about plants and gardening and nature, and so that again sort of infused this idea into these different spaces of the park. And so the intent was really that the horticulture should support the program of the space, whether it's a play space, an outdoor dining area, an open lawn space, a passive rec space. But going back to this idea of variety of experience, I think it was really important that this transformed from something that was a large open lawn space with a managed woodland into something that was much more complex experientially. And de facto, by all of the grading that we had done to try to solve some of the connection issues, it created a whole series of different microclimates and different solar aspects. So it allowed a lot of different plantings to survive. And honestly, we're still sort of learning on site actually, how this is impacting certain species, and things that we thought would grow in a certain instance are not, and then certain things that we didn't think are sort of thriving. So, and that will certainly change over time. So we'll just touch on 4 spaces to wrap up here. The first is one of the playground areas. This area of the park is a 7-acre playground, and we'll start on this one on the left here. So there are some overarching themes throughout the playground. One was that we really would like to sort of re-engage kids with natural materials and to sort of feel that immersion with plants. And you can kind of see that happening with these circuitous pathways and spaces divided by trees, ground cover planting, those types of things. It's a little bit more evident in this photo where the plantings obviously help to create these different rooms. You never really understand the perimeter of the space, right? Because it's so circuitous by nature. Also, you'll notice some of the existing trees here. The whole playground was purposefully set below the existing woodland to try to provide at least some level of immediate shade. And in other areas where large collections of elms happened is where we sited buildings or large equipment that required a larger footprint. So it was a sort of analyzing the existing condition and citing program elements based on the different tree types that were there and the health of them. So this is the Ramble space. It's called the Ramble Sensory Garden. All these different pink dots in here are different play features. So there are these sort of connected microphones that you can kind of talk to your friend in some other space in the hedge maze. There are these turning stones, there are these wind chimes, there's this German equipment manufacturer that we've worked with on several other projects. The name of the company is called Richter. Some of you may have heard about them, but they are just fantastic, like top-notch play equipment manufacturers. Are much more than just making play equipment. They understand kids and challenges and kids and nature, and again, they sort of pushed the envelope on some of this stuff and helped us develop the plan. So this is one of the moments in the vertical garden, these hornbeam rooms or hedges, but again, the idea is that the plants themselves are part of the play experience. They're not on the periphery, but they're really part of something that you move around and feel a part of. This was an area where there were several trees in poor condition, so the intent was to try to create a void within the existing woodland, all while preserving some of the healthier trees. For the ones that were not as healthy, we actually cut a lot of those down, and depending on the wood species, we would reuse them as some of the seating throughout the playground. And here's that hedge maze. You can see kind of these little telephones popping up in the maze. And this took a lot of coordination with the Brightview team too, to try to make adjustments on the fly when different root conditions were encountered. And it wasn't perfect, but I think through a dialogue we kind of got there.
Yeah, for sure. This was another challenge we had is, as he touched on, we were putting the playground within an existing forest, so to speak, and trying to keep equipment. We kept equipment off of the soils as we were placing them, but also trying to keep equipment off of the trees as we were bringing in plant material and different plants. There's some 10-inch trees 12-inch trees that we planted throughout here. And honestly, if one of them ever dies, we'll never be able to get in there to replace it, just because you'd have to demolish a playground area to do it. So trying to make sure we got in there early, really did a good job of taking care of our plants. We did a lot of air spading for discovery. Trying to get the irrigation through all these existing forests was a little bit of a challenge. So lots of air spading to try to just figure out where the big roots were and where we could put pipe, not put pipe. It was very challenging, and so the playground was one of the hardest pieces. It also went early, so we had to get in there before the general contractor finished all the paths, before they did all the rails. So again, we like to have all fences and lights done before we plant our plants. Well, that didn't work here because all our plants went between fences. So we had to plant our plants, and then the contractors came back in and put fences up, after we had planted. So it was a little bit of a challenge. We had some replacements, some different things, some coordination, and, tried to keep away from the finger pointing. But, and you can see just some of the, a lot of the elements up through there. A lot of those are existing trees on the top side of that. So again, it's just kind of a picture that shows just through those elements we had to move around and maneuver through a lot of big trees. I'm going to touch on the wetland gardens, and if you can see, so he showed an earlier slide, and it pumps out of the Blair Pond and water flows. You can see the channels weaving, and it spills back into the dam into the pond in a couple places. But the wetland gardens was just one of the coolest things. Had tons of different plant materials. Another challenge is the shipping wetland plants. If you ship wetland plants to a job site in July and August when you're planting it, and then it's not ready to plant, they die. So they had to kind of go from truck straight back into the water. It was definitely tough. And then again, they had to get in and do the stonework first. So just trying to work through the stonework and just the coordination of all these pieces. You can also see all the stone weirs that were created and done, and it's just a really cool piece. And like I said, we did it about a year and a half before the project was open, and so it was a really big concern about maintenance and how it was going to do. And we got a couple slides. This was just right after we planted, and this was kind of a few weeks later. You can just see some of the rock and stone weirs, and you got the channels. And this is, that's like opening day or somewhere in there, and it just shows the height of the plants over those stone weirs. It really did well. You see the wetland mixes. We had 2 different mixes that went through most of it. About 25 in the first mix, about 10 or 12 in the second. The 3 pink ones are highlighted for their ability to pull phosphorus out of the water. That was very intentional. Just trying to clean the water and put it back into Blair Pond, be able to use it and keep the pond clean. It was a big focus of ours. So.
The next is spaces, the patio. This is one of the comments that came back in the public engagement session was this idea that Tulsans love eating outdoors. A lot of their downtown spaces are centered on this, and it's one of the few things that I think brings them together. And so there's a couple of these moments in the park. This one was actually sited below a mature oak canopy. These were, 80-foot tall oaks or something like that. And so it was really important to try to understand how the proposed improvements would impact them. Here they're excavating for the lodge foundation. And in this next slide, the intent was to try to provide access below the canopy without impacting the canopy with foot traffic and soil compaction and those sorts of things. So we developed this deck system that is sited on a whole field of micropiles. Micropiles are very small. They have an 8-inch diameter in this instance, but very low impact. Even the rig equipment used to drill them is very low impact. And so this series of micropiles field was laid out, and each one was air spaded to understand the different root locations, and some were shifted depending on that. And it basically allowed this slab to be poured on top, and all of the water and circulation that would happen naturally just continue to happen. And so actually those voids that you see in the detail there were cardboard forms. So the pour had something to rest on, and then they disintegrated over time and would, then left the void space. Kind of a fun fact. And so this is the patio, or the beer garden as it's known. And then finally, I mentioned earlier the idea of this sort of cross timbers landscape being the kind of overlay over all of the larger non-programmed spaces. And so we did a series of meadow mock-ups very early on with Matt and his team to understand, how that whole sequence would work. And I think it was useful in some ways and maybe not so useful in others. I think, one of the challenges with this site is obviously the steep slopes that were created. So we tried to anticipate that a little bit. This image on the left is actually not from Tulsa, but we did the same approach on some of the Brooklyn Bridge Park work, where you dimple the surface, the entire surface right before it's seeded, and it creates these little cups for the seeds to fall within and prevents them from washing down. Now, it won't prevent, a 10-year storm from sort of washing all the seed out, but your sort of normal rain event would capture that seed and hold it in place. So coupling that with other areas that were hydro-seeded, some were successful, and quite honestly, this was and still is one of the biggest challenges on the project. So this image on the left shows one of the very, very steep berms that was hydro-seeded, I think a couple of times, both of which I think we had a tremendous amount of rain during the construction of the project, so it pushed windows into seasons that you wouldn't normally seed or plant in. And this is sort of the result of that. But there was also a lot of fine tuning that happened, I think. I don't know, do you want to talk a little bit about that and the management? And
Yeah, it was, so there were seeding windows typically. Our group is mostly from Dallas. This was 5 hours north, so the seeding window for us has always been kind of May 1st to September 1st for most of our warm season grasses. And, we can usually push up against those seeding windows and still be successful. That was not the case here. So we had a couple seeding windows. They're like, let's go ahead and shoot the hydromulch. Let's go ahead and shoot the seeding. And it didn't work well. We have, I think, 8 different seed mixes on the job with about 60 different seed varieties. And you can tell when we miss seeding windows, none of them like the conditions. So we missed some germination. So that was a big lesson learned, big learning curve. We also we put down really good soil. I mean, we've imported 200,000 yards of really good soil. We're next to a river, there's birds, there's wind, there's water. There is a lot of grasses that are going to come up that we didn't plant. So when we got into kind of the spring, summer of 18, when we were getting ready, 4 to 5 months before we were getting ready to open, the landscape management, not maintenance. Where'd my management lady go? It's landscape management of the meadow mixes. We had 30 people doing nothing but pulling weeds. This whole job site would have been a cottonwood forest if we had let it go. The amount of seed that came in naturally with the soil was amazing. And that was one of our issues. So going right up until September when we opened, we had almost 30 people pulling weeds and, trying to keep the native areas. And coming this spring so far, the amount of work we did pulling those weeds over the last summer has paid off so far. It's a lot less going into it. There's always going to be issues, management of those areas, but if you can kind of get the big ones out, and we didn't let them come to seed, didn't let them head out. We went ahead and got rid of them quickly, and I think it's paying off on the back end.
I think part of, too, why we did the mock-ups was to demonstrate to the client that what these meadows would look like 3 years out. So we literally did them 3 years ahead of time, knowing that meadows are not easy to establish. There's a 2-year period that they just look like shit. I mean, they're just awful, right? And especially the expectation on opening day that this was, this had to be, beautiful was just not realistic, right? I mean, it takes that long to try to get these things established. So here are a few moments where things are, on their way. Still some stuff popping up, but, heading in the right direction.
To kind of wrap up, just wanted to kind of go through some numbers, and this is kind of, we do a lot of landscape. I've been with Brightview for going on 17 years now. We've planted a lot of trees, done a lot of shrubs. We delivered over 600,000 shrubs to this job site. Between plugs, shrubs, you can see some of the numbers. Just bamboo, we delivered 27,000 bamboo to the job site. Holy cow, I hadn't planted that much in my entire career probably. It was a lot. Trees, we planted 6,500 trees, about 115, 112 different varieties. I think, we've talked a lot about this in some of the other conversations today, but I think what MBVA did on their tree design was really unique. Obviously, 6,500 trees on 66 acres, that's not going to be there 10 years from now. Basically, they created a site for natural selection to take over. And it also creates a unique environment of change. So you can go to the park year over year, and there's areas where we have full sun meadow mixes that as the trees grow, they're going to shade out some of the meadow mixes. The mixes are going to change. The 6,500 trees, some trees are going to outperform others. We've got a 2-year warranty on it, so I guess they're good. All trees will perform for 2 years.
You're screwed.
And then after that, but again, it's natural selection. It gives it a chance to change. And there's going to be some trees that grow fast, some that grow slow. But with 113 different varieties, it was very challenging. It took us it was over a year of just procurement and tagging of trees and shrubs and photos. And we had two full-time people doing trees and shrub procurements for over a year.
Yeah.
But it was just a lot of really cool plants were delivered to the job, and just the amount of, just the quantities, just unreal. So
That's it. Thank you all.
Any questions?
$500 million.
You had to bring it up, huh? No.
And you spent every cent.
Yeah. I mean, the construction costs for this were about 220. So there was a lot of it is in land acquisition. Not all of which is in this phase either. There's some land purchases that extend to the south and further east that also are wrapped up in that. There's also a significant city contribution. So basically, when an undertaking like this happens, obviously you try to tease out what other projects or engineering improvements the city has lined up for the next 2 years, 5 years, et cetera, to try to pair up those efforts. And so they basically fast-tracked a couple of projects that they had on the books to try to, sync these up to make it more efficient so that they weren't coming back later on, digging up, finished streets and rights of way and things like that. So between the city contributions, the land acquisition, construction costs, it was.
And the majority of it was donated. I mean, that George Kaiser donated, over half of that. So he's a billionaire. He can kind of spend his money how he wants. I'm glad he did it. For the city of Tulsa, this is amazing. This has absolutely transformed the city. It's made it you don't think of Tulsa as a destination place. This is absolutely a destination spot because of this park.
Yeah, it did not cost the public any money. Other than the infrastructure projects that the city had planned through tax dollars, but they even set up a maintenance endowment to basically take care of it for the next 100 years.
I guess you talked a little bit about air spading. Are there any other technologies that you guys have used, say in horticulture, that just made your jobs 10 times easier? Or anything, I guess, that if you would have done it the traditional way, going around poking with a rod for tree roots, or just any other technologies that people installing landscapes on a smaller scale, if they would use, would just make 10 times easier?
The air spading was great in helping us find the roots. It's not necessarily the fastest way all the time, but it's definitely the least invasive for the existing trees and the healthiest for the trees. We GIS'd all the trees, 6,500 of them are on a mount somewhere. That was something kind of different, but again, that was due to the magnitude of the project. We just Equipment-wise, we bought a lot of really unique equipment. That long-reach hoe excavator is not typically used in a landscape setting. I don't know that we've ever had one in a landscape setting. We have 16 branches across the country, and that was the first one we'd ever purchased. The Scarab was a very unique tool for mixing. So there were some unique tools, but stuff that we brought back and used on us. I say that. We manufactured a tiller for a mini excavator and helped till the slopes. We also built booms on our mini excavators and just built some machines for the job that we've actually using back in Dallas now on kind of hard to reach spots. So there are a handful of things, but nothing that's like, wow, this made our life that much easier. So,
I mean, a lot of it too is those guys were mobilized on site for probably a year. All of the different paths in the playground are bounded by a low railing that's attached to a curb, and everything is on piers. Again, just thinking about the impact of the tree roots. So not only were they aerospating for the micropiles, but they had basically an on-call job to lay out and aerospate at all of the different pier locations for foundations as well. So.
At what point in the process was Brightview brought on as the contractor as part of was there a collaboration as a component of the design process, or was it the design complete and you guys executed that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's a good question.
well, first off, we lost the job. So there was a general contractor brought on board that hired a different landscape company, and as a team, they could not meet the owner's budget or schedule, and so the job hadn't really kicked off yet. It was about to kick off, and that general contractor landscaper got kind of kicked to the curb, and we got brought in, and it was the happiest day of our life. So it was but that we as far as collaboration, there was a lot of it on site. MVVA had somebody on site almost every day for 2 years, working with us. So on the design side, we didn't collaborate a lot, but I would dare say less than 25% of the plant material on the site is placed per plans.
Yeah.
it's the
fair.
majority of it is a collaboration. We're laying out stuff, we're moving it, what works, especially like in the playground. That was a really, we got trees in there. We don't want them to compete with the existing trees. We want to give those trees a chance. So it was a lot of tree moving. It'd be a big root, we'd move a tree. So just throughout the project, there was a lot of collaboration. Most of it was post-design.
Yeah. I think, but now though, obviously there are lots of things that we've learned from each other, and we could share some of the, I think Sarah's about to ask some questions too, but not everything went well. In fact, there were a lot of things that didn't go well at all, and we're happy to share some of that. But I think, because of that, I think we all know for next time, and it's, huge lessons learned. Do you have a question?
How'd that go?
Pretty well.
Just
Yeah.
like a ditch witch comes down with a nozzle and sprays in?
Yeah, that's it. I mean, so there's this existing stand of trees was really, really important for kind of containing the playground, but also so that when the lawn space was created, that it wasn't like totally naked just sitting there, right? It had some type of veil between it and the playground. And so that's actually where we switched to a different wall system. That's a secant pile wall, if you know what that is. You basically drill down, and it's filled with a much lower strength concrete, and then you drill in between those two piers and drop a cage in, and then it's cast in, and basically it's watertight. But it needed to. The whole point was that it needed to retain the earth because we couldn't excavate back for the geogrids, and so then it transitioned out to the slurry wall.
Kind of interesting, because I've never heard of a slurry wall before being used, but we're considering one. I mean, they're expensive.
Yeah.
I mean, we're looking at $10 million on ours to supplement water to the river, and so they're pretty cool to see another project
Yeah.
bringing that design.
Yeah.
What's your strategy to programming the Sky Garden?
So the Sky Garden, there are if you look at the plan, there aren't a ton of lawn spaces, there aren't a lot of quiet moments. Like I mentioned, this is the slide bale, like right next to the lawn space, and then you're walking through playground spaces. So this was a moment where, this is the Four Seasons Garden. So you touch down on the roadway at grade level, and you rise up about, probably by that point you're about 20 feet higher than the beginning of the path. And that whole garden that stone garden is all about containment, right? And sort of moving between these different stone outcrops and obviously shielding your view from the roadway and also giving some privacy to the neighbors. So it was basically the opposite of that experience as you sort of emerged from that walled-in landscape, and then you pop out into one of the high points of the site, and it was all about just a lawn space in the sky. I mean, even the planting there is narrow junipers and ginkgo trees, so it's not a heavy shaded canopy. It's very light. All the planting is quite architectural, but light. And I don't know if that answers your question. Oh, and then on the perimeter, sorry, it's really there's a really heavy herbaceous layer throughout, and so there are benches on the sides of these circuitous paths, so you can, if you're not one of those people that likes being out in an open space, you can kind of, tuck back into the garden space and look out onto the lawn.
Can you indicate your vehicular circulation and how much parking you had around the perimeter?
Sure, yeah. So one of the things that became apparent just in the very early stages of the competition was kind of this theme of like the ease of the city. Like everything is very easy to get to, it's very easy to travel through. And I think, the last thing that we wanted to do is to try to introduce a parking structure. Like how tough is that experience to drive to a park in the parking structure, then exit the parking structure? I mean, it's just the whole sequence of that is sort of just odd. And so this was actually, I think the two ideas actually that won us the competition were, one, the land bridge, and second was the parking strategy. So this whole road that sort of loops around this existing tree and kind of comes back. There's all parking spaces along the entire length there. There are these kind of satellite lots that allow you to plug into, if you're kind of more familiar with the park, to sort of plug you in, where you want to be. There's a large parking lot down on the south end of the park by those blue courts. And then there's another satellite parking lot right by the skate park there. So all in total, I think there were 540 spaces. And right now they're using the Phase 2 site. They've paved the whole thing just because of the amount of visitorship that they've received so far. They just haven't been able to accommodate all the parking. So I assume that some of that will die down with time, but honestly, it could have used, at least a few hundred more.
So you've lost your great lawn to the new program?
I'm sorry?
You've lost your great lawn to the new program?
No, sorry. So the parking was, the parking is back there, and this is still the great lawn. Yeah.
That's all part of Phase 2.
So you guys do these like really beautiful models, right? So I was wondering, could you just speak briefly about kind of the design team that goes into something like that, and how maybe you use models to look more spatially? Because I know MBDA's projects typically are not typical kind of landscapes, but have these spatial qualities. They use the materiality and plants to create. If you could talk a little about the process of that design.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually should have included more photos in here because we built, 50 models, 60 models for this project, most of which weren't presentation models. I think the thing that's dangerous about models is when you go into that sort of presentation mode and they become too special where you don't want to change ideas or augment them in some way, right? You get too invested in something that you're reluctant to change it or kind of step back for a second. And so most of our models are actually quite ugly, like embarrassingly ugly. But it's okay, they're meant to try to test ideas and to see how things come together. They could be as, as detailed as some of those, figuring out the stone intersections of some of those walls. Like I said, we provided the contractor with some of those models. Then there are, some models that are all paper, just trying to, figure out a programming strategy. And so it's an insanely useful tool to understand, like you're saying, the spatial aspects of what you're creating. And with Mac's office too, I mean, we build models, that we can fit each other's work in, so that we can say, hey, that doesn't, feel quite right, but an extremely useful tool.
So how many people are on this project during design phase?
Matt asked me that yesterday. Not enough. I think we were working, 80 plus hours a week for like years and years. It was just, I don't know, at the height of the CD phase, maybe 10, possibly 12. But yeah, it's not enough. Yeah, not enough.
Okay.